I'm Pauline Yu. I'm president for 17 more days of the American Council of Learned Societies. And as one of this meeting's co-sponsored, I'm very pleased to welcome you to the international keynote panel of the Symposium on the Future of Academies that has been organized by the American Philosophical Society. Leaders of many of the world's learned academies have gathered here to discuss their research missions and to open up avenues for possible continued conversations and collaboration. Earlier this afternoon, we introduced ourselves to each other, and tomorrow we'll be meeting in executive session to discuss current challenges and future opportunities that all of us face in 5 key areas: membership, technology, communication, funding, and collaboration. For this evening's program, we've convened a panel of eminent academy leaders to discuss the present status and future prospects of science, scholarship, and knowledge, as well as their preservation and dissemination. It's going to be a good discussion, so I don't want to go into elaborate detail about their biographies. I will simply name them and indicate their institutional affiliation in alphabetical order. We will have Ali Alpar, President of the Science Academy in Turkey; James C. Liao, President of the Academia Sinica in Taiwan; Antonio Loprieno, President of ALLEA, the European Federation of Academies of Sciences and Humanities, and at the same time, President of the Swiss Academies of Arts and Sciences; Marcia McNutt, President of the National Academy of Sciences in Washington; and Moneef Zou'bi, Director General of the Islamic World Academy of Sciences in Jordan. And now I'm pleased to turn the podium over to our equally distinguished moderator, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the New York Times, Mark Thompson. Thank you very much.
Here we have our frighteningly distinguished panel coming on. Marcia, why don't you sit next to me? So good evening, everyone. In many ways, historically, and members of the public sometimes think of learned academies as private clubs. They have some of the attributes of private clubs. Actually, and I think the more you know about them, the more you believe this, they're public institutions. They have high public purposes, and it's one of their big purposes in almost all cases is to have a communion with the public. So it's very appropriate that in the middle of this symposium about sharing the future of learning academies, that there should be a session which is open to the whole public. Some of the people who've gathered from all over the world to be here are with me on the panel, and you've heard them introduced already. But we've got a few more out here in the audience. I would just ask, if we can, the members of the symposium briefly to stand up to identify themselves. If you come to the symposium, please just stand up, and the rest of us can welcome our guests to Philadelphia. Now, the meat of this session is going to be to let each of these guys give us a perspective on the present, maybe the past, but the present and the future of their learned academy. And there's going to be a chance for everyone here to ask questions. Probably worth perhaps just beginning by defining what we mean by a learned academy. Now, my experience of public audiences, the American Philosophical Society, they're usually pretty learned themselves, so there may well be people who could do a better job than me. But I think we could perhaps begin with that middle word in the badge of the APS, the American Philosophical Society. Now, we tend to think of philosophy around the very specific discipline of the study and development of ideas around ethics and metaphysics and ontology and epistemology and linguistics and so on. At the time when the APS was founded in the 18th century, it was used much more broadly to talk really about the advancement, the promotion, the development of knowledge very widely. And it spanned the sciences, the natural sciences, in those days, very early development of the social sciences, economics and other social sciences, but also the humanities. So that notion of knowledge, and one of the ideas within that in some learned academies has been this notion of useful knowledge. Benjamin Franklin, who is looking beadily down on us, when he was in London, was a passionate fellow of the Royal Society, a rather classic, by some measures, one of the very first classic scientific learned academies. He was also a passionate fellow and a very enthusiastic fellow of another Royal Society, the Royal Society of Arts, for the encouragement of arts, manufactures, and commerce in London. Very interested in the application of knowledge. Nowadays, I think it's fair to say most learned academies would think of the pursuit of knowledge both in its purer but also in its applied sense, and not be too rigid about that. How do they do it? Well, they generally try and bring the best and the brightest together from many different disciplines to share discoveries and insights, and also to debate them and expose them to peer scrutiny. They sponsor, and when they can, support research. They disseminate knowledge through the publication of transactions and monographs and many other kinds of outreach. And they also store and preserve knowledge for future generation in archives and libraries and so on, much of that now online. Crucially, there's also a tradition of them collaborating with each other. There's a wonderful Enlightenment notion of the Republic of Science and the Republic of Letters, the idea that scientists and scholars have a responsibility to reach out to each other beyond cultures and beyond different disciplines. And there's much else besides, and I'm sure some of these guys will talk about that. Now, when you say that, how can you possibly be against that? You know, and why do you even need to have a symposium? Isn't it so obvious that this is a virtuous, splendid thing that you know, that why should there be any questions or doubts about what you do with them? Now, of course, like many of our other institutions, learned academies in 2019 face, despite that kind of bedrock of mission and belief, they face many real questions. And I'm going to raise a few questions. They're the questions, I think, which will come up in the more private parts of the symposium. And I'm not going to say, I'd like to just simply hear perspectives from each of these guys, but let's bear these questions in mind, and maybe some of them will reflect on them. Firstly, although I think many members of this audience will still find it slightly hard to believe, science scholarship and even the notion of the possibility of objective knowledge and facts about the world are probably more under assault in 2019 than at any time since the Enlightenment. What's the role of learned academies in the wider battle for knowledge and the pursuit of truth? Secondly, there's another revolution going on, and this, in many ways, at least to me, feels like a far more positive one. And this revolution is really about the way societies think about diversity, of gender, of race, of age, of culture, and of opportunity. When we think about the best and the brightest and the people who can most help us understand the world, at a practical level, the membership of learned academies, do they look like they do that they embrace that? And if not, how quickly can you move to change that? And what are the risks as you move to change that? So there's a whole profound debate, often about age, but actually age is only part of the story. Gender, race, culture, and the rest of it's part of it as well. And thirdly, more broadly, how can they ensure that their communications, both with the wider scientific and scholarly community, but also with the public at large, remains relevant and really kind of makes the most of all of the new opportunities of digital media and the way people actually exchange ideas and thoughts and opinions today? How do these academies secure themselves financially and make sure they've still got the wherewithal to deliver on all those goals, and also to continue to contribute meaningfully to research, which is increasingly and astonishingly complex and expensive activity? And finally, I mean, I think the fact that people have come to Philadelphia suggests that every single Learned Academy represented here believes in principle in the idea of sharing ideas and trying to learn from each other and potentially also to collaborate. Just how well do today's Learned Academies seize that opportunity to work with each other? So with those perspectives in mind, I just wonder whether we could begin to hear from each of our representatives. The APS has given me extraordinarily strict instructions about time. No more than 10 minutes, 5 minutes, excellent, 10 minutes, still okay, 11 minutes, and the executive director of the APS will be there with a dart gun to bring your remarks to a close. But give us a sense, a perspective of how this broad topic and these questions strike you, but also a sense of what you do with your particular, because I think one of the things I'd love to get across is the diversity of the experience of different Learned Academies. And I wonder, perhaps then, whether we could begin. Should we begin with you, Antonio? So, Antonio Loprieno, who's the president of ALLEA, which is a European Federation of Academies of Sciences and Humanities based in Berlin.
Thank you, Mark. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy, and it's a distinct pleasure to be here today. I took my Swiss watch in order to measure precisely between 5 and 10 minutes of what I'm going to say. I'll have to use my first 10 seconds, however, to say that there is a second reason why I'm particularly happy and particularly moved today, because I was introduced by Pauline Yu, who actually was my boss, was my dean when I was at UCLA many centuries ago. Before she was born, she was actually already a dean. So first I would like to tell you a couple of words on the Federation of Academies I represent here, which is far more interesting than the academy of a small country such as Switzerland. And the name is ALLEA, which is an acronym for All European Academies. And in fact, it is the federation of about 60 academies of about 40 countries all over Europe, Western and Eastern Europe, not only the European Union, but also the countries of Eastern Europe in general. And they are very different structures and very different academies in typology or in size. You have learned societies of the type that Mark just introduced, such as the Royal Society or the Académie Leopoldina, the National Academy of Germany, or the Académie des Sciences in France, so very distinguished and prestigious institutions that have been around for 300-400 years, and that enjoy a particular prestige within their own society. But there are also, among these 60 members of our academies, research funding institutions. Some of the academies in Central and Eastern Europe have their own research institutes, are not just learned societies. So we combine, so to say, the two identities. We are based in Berlin for historical reasons, but our main center of activity is in Brussels, that, as you know, is the center, the political center of the European Union, with which perhaps I can come to the main function or the main field of activity of our federation, which is providing science advice for the European Union. We are embedded into a so-called science advice mechanism. You know, sometimes the European Union has very complicated structures. I hope there are no spies here who will betray me. But so what we do as a Federation of Academies is to receive invitations by the European Union to provide scientifically based advice on issues that are of concern for European governments and particularly for the European Commission. These are on the whole macro issues, of course, global issues, but sometimes with very specific expectations, microplastics or how to organize data governance at the European level. So this is our first, perhaps more visible type of activity at the EU level. There is a second tier, if you will, of activities that we have, and that is equally important, perhaps from the point of view of the cohesion among the academies, even more important than our political activity, which is fostering inter-academic partnership and research projects. For those of you who know perhaps the recent history of Europe, there has been after 89, 90, there has been a form of overcoming of the traditional distinction between Western and Eastern Europe. So more and more there are research projects that are conducted by 2 or more academies, and ALLEA takes care of combining or of generating, providing a basis for this type of scientific activity. We also gave ourselves recently a new strategy, which I will be happy to provide you with, so in case you're interested, because it's good to have a new strategy. It looks good in the corporate world, and so you can actually climb up the social ladder if you do so. Mark mentioned the major challenges that we are facing, and what I'm going to say right now in the 2.5 minutes left dovetails very much on the issues that he himself actually addressed. The first is the first challenge that we are facing is what I would subsume under the heading populism. Right? So we observe more and more the threat of populism rising in European societies, even at the governmental level. And one of the side effects of populistic or populistically leaning government is to marginalize the role of science or of scholarship in society. We are now, one of the main activities that I had recently was to write letters and in more or less direct ways to the Hungarian government. Hungary and to a certain extent Poland are now very much facing this populistic threat, which is accompanied by a general distrust or loss of trust in science, and usually in a kind of anti-experts polemic. This is, by the way, something that does not only concern the countries such as Poland or Hungary, but that we have been very much in contact with our British colleagues of the Royal Society, of the British Academy, of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, because Brexit is felt by British scientists and scholars to be to a certain extent a result of populism that marginalizes and limits their presence at the European level, because if Brexit comes, that will have a major impact on the access of British scholars to European funding schemes. And the second challenge is age, or aging, the age of our members. We are trying to cope with the relatively compact structure of our academies in terms of diversity by creating young academies. There are many European countries now in which young academies are developing, and this is a movement we favor. And the third challenge, I would call it social knowledge. That is, our academies are very much linked to a particular view of knowledge that I would describe as book-based knowledge. And they are less, perhaps, they have been less ready to accept the challenge of digitalization and of the change from individual knowledge to social knowledge, or knowledge transmitted through social media. This is where I think academies on the European continent are also facing a major threat or a major challenge. And prima facie, I would say this is probably a challenge that is not limited to the European continent, but is also felt in other regions of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio. Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'm going to move one to your right if you're the audience, to Ali Alpar, who's the president of Turkey's leading science academy. Does again give us a perspective, but very interesting whether any of that resonates with your experience in Turkey as well.
It does, and I'll try to actually generalize some things about knowledge and wisdom, starting from the initial sort of philosophical introduction that Mark made. I'm looking at my Swiss Swatch watch.
Mine was not Swatch.
Mine is Swatch. I represent a very young academy, the Science Academy, Bilim Akademisi in Turkey, which was started only in 2011 in response to direct government interference in the academy. So we are based on principles of academic merit, academic freedom, and academic integrity. And we chartered ourselves as an NGO. So we work totally on the basis of support that we generate from civil society, no official support, and that has, I think, many advantages. If one wants to give a framework for academies in the social and cultural context, one can look at it as a conceptual framework and a historical cultural framework. Conceptually, it's about knowledge. And what kind of knowledge, in what form, is interesting and usable for society? Well, it's evidence-based knowledge. And that debate on the nature of knowledge is, of course, very old. So some of the issues that we are discussing today are age-old issues of human civilizations in all kinds of different contexts, coming up in different civilizations at different times, in the Islamic civilization, in China, in India. But the most recent embodiment of this idea of evidence-based knowledge is with the scientific revolution. So it came up in the Western European historical context, but it is a key, important heritage of all of us, all over the world. And what is that? That is that one needs to make decisions about this world based on evidence and logical processing of evidence. And this is the only kind of approach to knowledge that can form a basis for societal interaction, for a discussion. So it is really this approach of knowledge, which is really common sense. Make your decisions based on evidence. This is crystallized in science. And when I say science, I don't just mean the natural sciences. In any study of society or in the humanities, of texts or whatever, one needs to go for evidence. And this forms the basis for discussion. Because no matter how complex the issues are, if the method agreed on is to go for the evidence and to base a discussion on the evidence, not as a debate on who's louder, then that has to be the basis of any rational, sensible society. It is the basis of democracy, and it's the basis of secularism in the face of not only religion, but any kind of ideological preconceived notions. So what's the function of academies? Now, academies are just a small but historically very important element in this whole societal discussion of the attempt to reach knowledge. And they have been very much a part of the Enlightenment. And now academies, of course, are all over the world in different contexts, but when we come together, as we already witnessed in discussions today, concerns of academies, even about their own bodies, are first very common all over the world, and they arise sort of naturally when all the academies come together. And a big part of the concern is how to relate and how to perform a function in support of generation of rational knowledge in interaction with our societies. It has already been mentioned on this panel and several times in today's discussions, that I'm sure not just in academies, but in citizens' discussions all over the world, the issues of alternative facts, alternative truths, and populism. This is a real important issue where not only as academies, as citizens, we should all feel responsible. But it is not an issue only of our age. This discussion of whether decisions are based on evidence or not, in all times of crisis, think of the 20th century, think of the rise of the various totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, it goes hand in hand with those in power denying the need for evidence and dictating. And of course, this doesn't serve anybody, including those in power, but it does lead to a lot of suffering before societies can get out of such traps. All of this then makes it important to consider dialogue, and one important organized part of that dialogue or preparation for dialogue is education in our societies. So learned societies have a function also in keeping a dialogue with the public about the results as well as the issues and problems of science in particular, but also in defense of the scientific method, in defense of the need for evidence. And in that, one needs a lot of tact and humility. Because the access to education, access to knowledge, to training, is unfortunately as unequally distributed all over the world, and also in the most developed societies of the world, as class distinctions are. One of the advantages of our age is that, well, the internet and so on, the world has opened up a lot, and that has led to a climate where all over the world, every society can present, or individuals all over the world have much easier access in some ways to information. Not to evidence necessarily, but to information certainly. The general trend of the discussion in learned societies is to find ways to open up and to contribute. Okay? And certainly the internet age offers many opportunities in that. And another thing is with the opening up of the academic world. In the last maybe half century, we have seen a trend, a real trend, already starting to bear fruit, for sharing, first of all, across gender. 50% of the world's human resources are now joining in, across also generations, and one of the issues is for the learned societies is also how to themselves become younger and make contact with youth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you in particular for focusing on this battle between what in the Western tradition the ancient Greeks would have called episteme, true understanding, and doxa, opinion. It seems there's a battle, which by the way we feel in journalism as to try and pretend that carefully evidence-based reporting, which tries to seek the truth, is just another kind of opinion. And I think the role of learned academies and being one of the beacons and one of the ways in which the public can understand that distinction is really important. I wonder, coming to Marcia McNutt, who's the president of the National Academy of Sciences here in the US, tell us about the NAS, but perhaps also, in particular, how you think about the public understanding of science and knowledge, and how the National Academy can help promote that.
Sure. So, Mark, I really appreciated the questions that you started out with, including public understanding, because the issue today, in today's really complex society, it's only through science and new learning that one group of people can get ahead without another group of people falling behind. So we really have to count on careful application of new science and new understanding if we ever hope to raise people out of poverty and to improve quality of life. And so it is really of concern when people start to doubt evidence and when we enter what's called this post-truth era. So how can we restore trust in science? So there are two parts of it. One is science itself has to be trustworthy. And then secondly, we have to communicate well with the public so the public understands the fundamental nature of science, and we signal to them what science is trustworthy. And we consider this at the National Academy of Sciences our role to be the beacons of not only the trustworthiness of science, but also communicating to people the nature of science and what science they should consider trustworthy. So to do that, we're helping to set the highest standards of science and also working with the university community to make sure that their criteria for their reward system aligns well with what those standards are. Because unfortunately right now, there are some disincentives for researchers to always align their behavior with the highest standards, and unless the promotion and reward system is well aligned with the highest standards, we will not get trustworthy science. And then we're working with journals and other groups to signal when science has been proven to be trustworthy through a number of ways. It's not just one check. You can reproduce work, but also when it's been extended, when it's been independently verified by other means, when all conflicts of interest have been declared. There are many ways to, check off different ways that research has been shown to be trustworthy. So that's all part of, and then communicating to the public. Many members of the public, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here because this is a very sophisticated audience, but many members of the public were taught when they were in school that science is a list of facts. And therefore, they get horribly confused when they hear, coffee's good for you. No, coffee's bad for you. Oh, drink red wine. No, avoid red wine. Well, of course they get confused because they don't understand what is meant by good for you and who is you. Because what's good for me may not be good for Mark.
Yeah.
Okay? And so, this is very confusing to the public, and we have not done a good job as scientists of helping the public understand why both of those statements could be true depending on who you are. So we're trying as an academy to do a much better job of communicating the nature of science and the difference between what comes out in an individual study and what comes out as the scientific consensus, which is the gold standard. And if something is just an individual study, well, it's out there to be built upon, to be checked, but the consensus is something that is much more ready for use in policy. It is more likely to stand the test of time. Then I wanted to also comment on your very important point on diversity. At the Academy, it used to be we'd put out an important report on diversity, like our recent report on how sexual harassment is preventing many women from thriving in science. We just put it out there and say, okay, here it is. We hope, like, throwing seeds in the wind, they'll land someplace fertile and something will happen with them. Well, we're not doing that anymore. What we're doing now is following up with our landmark studies to make sure that they actually have some impact. So for the sexual harassment report, we've started an action collaborative, which is a collaborative of the willing, and now we are having to turn away universities in terms of presidents of universities that want to sit around the table to find out how can we make sure that we change the culture at our institutions to be welcoming to women and make sure that they thrive. And we're expanding this to other underrepresented groups. And then finally, just about communication. Let me just say 2 words about that. We recognize that communication is a two-way street, and not all people are science lovers or science savvy. So we're starting to make a lot more collaborations across cultural boundaries with the film industry, with the art industry, with different parts of the humanities, because we realize that sometimes the best way to reach people is where they are, not where we are. And the humanities, the arts, are great ways to reach people.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think what's so striking about hearing the presidents, we have one Director General still to come, but the president speaking, is how relevant the topics they're talking about and the concerns they're talking about feel to society at large. It's that idea of a kind of ivory tower doesn't feel very, very relevant when you hear these guys talking. Let's turn now to James Liao, who's the president of a scientific learned academy in Taiwan, the Academia Sinica. James, tell us what these topics and what the present and future of learned academies looks like from your vantage point.
Okay. Academia Sinica in Taiwan is chartered to conduct basic research or fundamental research. We have 2 components. One is a learned society. The other one, we actually have intramural research. So why do I bring up the fundamental research aspect? We've been talking about knowledge that can be used or actionable knowledge. But on the other hand, we are chartered to do fundamental research, meaning that research that produces results that may not be immediately applicable. And I will argue, since this is the Philosophical Society, I'll argue that most, if not all, of our most fundamental game changers resulted in research that has no purpose, and is no direct purpose. For example, Einstein's relativity wasn't set out to solve any problem. And we just celebrated a month ago the imaging of black hole. I'm sure many of you saw the story, which we, Academia Sinica, had a team participating in that effort. What does black hole has anything to do with our daily life or any technology that we can foresee in the near future? But that is so fundamental in the pursuit of pure knowledge. And most of the medical advances, I'm sure we can name one after another, was set out to do just pure understanding. So now there's an interesting debate of producing actionable knowledge versus curiosity-driven research. And we, as an academy, is trying to balance the two. On the one hand, we have to educate the government that invest in the future is extremely important. We cannot just look at application down the road a year or even a month away. On the other hand, we have to educate the general public that the tax-paying money is worth spending, that they generate the pure knowledge that help the whole humanity solve problems of large scale. Okay, for example, we all know about the CO2 accumulation problem. We all heard that IPCC has recommended that in 2050, we better achieve carbon neutral. But as a scientist in that field, I know we have absolutely no feasible way to achieve that. No feasible way that anybody can conceive of right now. So that takes a lot of research. And I believe that, I'm still hopeful, by the way. I'm still optimistic and hopeful. Why? I believe that we may still have time to develop new knowledge, new fundamental game changers that will change the course of our society. So those are the big issues that requires long-term effort, fundamental research. We don't set out to solve the carbon problem just by how to grab carbon from the thin air. Okay, we study physics, we study biology, we study chemistry, or even study social behavior, the social changes. How do we change everybody's behavior so that we can use less carbon-derived fuel, for example? So that requires a lot of fundamental research. And all these takes a concerted effort of scientists. And now Marcia mentioned that rewarding system. Actually, our current rewarding system is not favoring collaboration. It's favoring individual credits. So how do we develop a system that give due credits to collaborators? Okay? So that we can collectively solve a major problem that the South society faces. So that is what we as a collective learning society need to work on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, James. Again, thank you for that reminder about useful knowledge and the risk of trying to judge too soon whether a line of scientific inquiry, or indeed scholarly research, is going to prove useful. How often it turns out the thing which seemed the most abstract, the least likely to lead to practical use, has turned out to lead to really immense and positive changes in society.
Let me add, I remember the saying that there's nothing more useful than a good theory.
Now, our last, certainly not the least speaker on the panel, Moneef Zou'bi is the Director General of the Islamic World Academy of Sciences. Now, you've had the advantage of listening to all of the others speaking disagree, agree, sum up, but tell us above all, again, you know, how again, from again a different perspective, how these issues present to you and your academy.
Thank you, Mark. I agree 100% with everything that's been said on this thing this evening. Before I start, I need to mention something very quickly. I mentioned this to Professor Hauser before the break, and that is, I think this is a very special event. Gathering this group of people to address the role and functions of academies of sciences and learned societies is something that is very important. I cannot recall a seminar of this addressing this subject, except maybe 3 or 4. One was organized by the Australian Academy of Sciences in 1980, and the book resulting from that seminar is called Science and the Polity, Ideals, Illusions, and Realities. And there was an event held in Rome, in Trieste rather, at the Third World Academy of Sciences in 2003, and another organized by the Canadian CCCA at Trieste, also in 2009. And for those of us who are like me, run or try to run an Academy of Sciences, learning about best practices in the running and the administration of science academies, meetings such as this are critically important to see what's happening at the international level. Now, that's my introduction. Now, let me try and take you back about 12 centuries and tell you about the link between this, the mobile, and academies of sciences. Far-fetched, I know, but I'll give it a go. Now, this is essentially made up of processors and algorithms, isn't it? I think Professor Cole would agree with me on this. Now, algorithm comes from the word, the Arabic word, logarithmat, which comes from the very famous scientist and academician Al-Khwarizmi, who was a fellow, if that's the right word, of an ancient academy in the Middle East in Baghdad called Bayt al-Hikmah during the first decade of the 9th century. He was one of a group of people who were working at that Academy of Sciences. Incidentally, many scholars disagree with me that was an Academy of Sciences, including George Saliba of Columbia and Dimitri Gutas, but I have recently published something that actually goes some way into proving that that Academy of Sciences existed and acted as an Academy of Sciences, as a forum of discussion on serious scientific issues and a forum that produced recommendations to decision makers on a whole host of issues. So that's the initial link. Now, the academy I work for, based in Amman, Jordan, is trying to do just that, is trying to follow in the footsteps of great scientists of the past who were devoted to science, multidisciplinary, trying to make the world a better place. And this is what we are trying to do. Of course, as I mentioned earlier in the discussion, the founding principle for a good academy, to my mind, has always been, and I'm sure you'll all agree with me, is merit. Choosing scientists on merit and merit alone. Now, we may agree or disagree as to what merit means today, but essentially that element has to be there. And of course, some scientists, some scholars have described an Academy of Sciences as being the monarch of any STI ecosystem in any country. Now, coming from a monarchy like I do, Jordan, that's okay. But speaking about monarchy in this city, the bastion of republicanism, I'll leave that up to you. But that is how many people see and have seen academies of sciences. Academies have withstood the test of time and essentially have been trying to advise governments and decision makers and the public on science, science policy and science implementation, advocates for science, disseminating information, international collaboration, because science is essentially universal. Science is the language spoken by everybody everywhere. And we have to see science like this, because the problems we are facing today are universal as well. No longer are national problems that require scientific solutions confined to national borders. And this is why we have the SDGs adopted by the world community in 2015. And this is why academies of sciences are trying to utilize the tool of science, technology, and innovation to address the SDGs. Water problems are universal, health problems are universal, poverty, food security, energy insecurity, and so on and so forth. And lastly, I'll mention science education. I think one of the key areas that science academies need to look at and are looking at, indeed the US National Academy of Sciences was leader in this, in looking at the state of science education at American schools a few years ago and publishing that famous report, Rising Above the Gathering Storm. And then the French Academy of Sciences with their effort called La Main à la Pâte. So science education can be one of the standing activities that academies of sciences have to get into, not only to educate, as one of the previous speakers mentioned, educate our young students at school, our university students, our politicians and decision makers and members of parliament about the problems that we are facing as human beings. Problems that need global solutions and not national solutions, because, as I said earlier, science is universal. Joseph Needham, I'll finish with this, Mark. Joseph Needham asked the question a long time ago as to why didn't the scientific revolution take place in China or India, and took place in Europe, as mentioned by my eminent friend here. My answer to that is that it had to happen somewhere, whether in China, India, Europe, North America, and eventually it did and happened in Europe. But it was a result of a collective human effort to build up knowledge that led to the scientific revolution. So I think with that I'll say, yes, academies of sciences are an essential component of national STI systems. They probably need to think of a new business model for the 21st century. And at the center of this new business model, to my mind, I would say science education. Thank you.
Bravo. So, we're going to open up for questions. While our audience thinks about questions, perhaps I'll just throw one question to Marcia. I heard you talking in one of the sessions this afternoon before this event about the large proportion of new women members you're inviting into the National Academy. Just talk about how, on the ground, that business of shifting the balance of membership. What have been the challenges? Has that been broadly supported? Has there been opposition? What does it feel like if you're, at the helm and trying to, in a sense, reshape the way in which one of these academies thinks about, its new members coming in?
Sure. So what Mark's referring to is that at the last election, 40% of the new members elected to the National Academy are women. So this is an amazing proportion of women coming into the Academy in one class. The year before, it was 27%. So that's a huge jump in 1 year. And given in the disciplines that we elect into the Academy, the proportion of women in those fields at the senior level, which would be eligible for election to the Academy, is in the teens. This is remarkable that we are electing women at this rate, which is obviously making up for historic years of under-election of women to the Academy. And what's amazing is we did this without setting aside any slots for women. So we had no protected slots for women, and we had no quotas for women. So basically, this was all done by encouraging the members to nominate women and by encouraging the classes and sections to bring forward well-qualified women by saying that if your class elects a lot of women, you could perhaps get one more person to elect next year. But that was a maybe, and they had to be so well qualified that they actually made it to the members' ballot. So there was a very small incentive to bring women forward, and it resulted in a huge bumper crop. And what we're also seeing is in the nominations that haven't yet made it to the ballot, large numbers of well-qualified women who just missed the cut, so will probably be coming up in the future. So this is a really good sign for the Academy, and I think it shows that the large number of the dominant percentage of men in the Academy recognize that this is good for the Academy.
And when we turn to minorities, is it a similar story of progress? Or, I mean, I should say, at the New York Times, I think we've made really very significant strides with women across the population, including in senior management in our newsroom and our business side. I'm the chief executive. I would say we've much further to go with minorities, and notably with America's biggest minorities, namely Latinos and African Americans. But what's the story with the Academy?
So we have not been as successful with minorities. What we're finding is that when they get nominated, they have a very good chance of getting elected. But it is finding the well-qualified people to get nominated in the first place. And whereas compared to women, where there are sufficient numbers in our nation's departments and universities, that the numbers are there. They're just not there. So this is something that we really honestly want to deal with at all levels, not just by finding them and getting them nominated and getting them elected by methods such as developing special search committees that will focus on finding qualified people. So setting the example at the top, but then also working at the pipeline too.
Excellent. Now, questions from our audience. And there's a microphone there. Yeah.
I noticed, Marcia, that you talked about the alternative facts that are being stated right now. And I wondered how you all felt about how that's going to impact the actual facts, the actual research that all of you have been doing all this time. Is that going to affect you in a way that's going to challenge you more to get your information, the correct information out? Is this just something that's just passing, or is it something that's being done right now that's going to impact your research efforts from here on out? It's just a problem right now, or is it going to affect us from here on out?
Free choice. Why
so,
don't you start, Marcia?
yeah,
But the
okay.
others, I'm sure one or two of the others will want to talk as well.
So the studies that have been done on this are very interesting because they show that it's not necessarily partisan and it's very issue specific. So for example, and it all shows that much of this goes down to purposeful misinformation campaigns by certain vested interest groups who want to make sure that they sow doubt and uncertainty on issues such as climate change or nuclear power or GMOs or vaccines. You name the topic, there's a special interest group that wants to make things seem more uncertain than it is. Then there are other issues where no one's trying to sow any misinformation and everyone agrees with the science and there doesn't seem to be any problem. And so, for example, with nuclear, it's people left of center that are more concerned about it than right compared to where the science says the safety is. And with climate change, of course, it's the people more right of center that are concerned about the science than the others. So, and it all has to do with special interest groups. So unless we deal with special interest groups, we aren't going to get rid of the problem.
So, Antonio.
Well, you know, when you speak about alternative facts, you are basically touching on an issue that concerns, to a certain extent, the entire access to knowledge in the present times. And that is, so I would like to make a distinction between information and knowledge. You see, information is now can be very easily transmitted, you know, in a digital way, and can be built up to kind of alternative type of knowledge. But true knowledge always requires, let's call it a frame, yeah, an interpretative frame within which you can read it. And so the difficulty we're experiencing now has ultimately to do with the transition to a digital access to knowledge, because it's now becoming very, very easy to spread information before this information has reached the stage of knowledge, when it is still, so to say, dirty information or information with some noise. And in order to remove the noise or to remove the dirt, to transform into knowledge, you need some kind of an interpretive frame. And that is where now we are missing somewhat. We are in the phase of transformation, and in the time of analogical knowledge. We knew how to do it. You know, before you published a book, you had to go through a publisher. There was a committee of readers that would say, yes, it's good or it's not good. Now, if you do it, you know, in 1 second by digital form, by social media, then you don't have the filters. And we still need to learn how to develop these necessary filters. I think it's a challenge for all sciences, for all scholarship, for all disciplines right now.
Excellent. There's a question here.
I have a related question. I'm currently the president of the American Political Science Association. About a quarter of our members are international, and many are facing the kind of populist pressures that affect our research that you commendably addressed. But I was particularly struck because a couple of you said that our reward systems don't necessarily reward the highest forms of scholarship or collaborative scholarship or merit. And I would like to hear more about why you think that is, how that is. Are there political pressures? Are there market mechanisms? Are there problems with our traditional peer review systems relating to new forms of knowledge? Why aren't we necessarily discerning and rewarding the best work?
Great question. And if I can say, whoever wants to answer that, if you can give us an example or two of what we're talking about in answering it.
I think this is the result of free market in a general way. Because we are in a very competitive world, and academics in particular. So all universities in the world are engaging in this quantitative indices, okay, usually are published by some publishers, okay, use various kind of simplified quantitative indices to judge whether this person is of merit or not. So you simplify a multidimensional aspect into a one-dimensional number. And this has been a disease going on in the academic world. Okay.
But just to spell it out, so a successful experiment, which leads to a paper, might lead to a grant, might lead to a job, whereas an unsuccessful experiment, which might simply be testing a theory to destruction and demonstrating that it doesn't work, that the risk is that the incentives for the researcher in that case are not to be as rigorous as they might be. Is that the kind of thing we're talking about?
Because we're facing, this is, the academy these days are very much like a marketplace, especially in a competitive world. A young assistant professor is given 6 to 8 years at maximum to prove himself or herself. So within this short period of time, he or she will have to produce something original. So the easiest way to find something that's sure to publish, and publish it in credible journals and get those indices high. So you calibrate the risk that way. So unless we change this reward system in a dramatic way, it's difficult to change. But I'm hopeful, because just like any market phenomenon, it's going to correct itself. Okay, already we see quite a few universities are talking about correcting itself.
Ali.
Part of the problem is numbers. I think the number of scientists practicing, number of papers published, all of these are expanding at a tremendous rate. And what is needed is a qualitative assessment, and it's very difficult. So institutions, journals, everything goes for, as mentioned, numerical indicators, and we haven't found a way to get out of this. So they just count numbers of papers and so on.
Question here.
Thank you. Tina Parolin from the Australian Academy of Humanities. Sorry for my back. I thought I might be a little bit provocative, and this question relates to both the previous questions about the post-truth era and different forms of knowledge. And I wonder how well, as an academy, little a, and as learned academies, we respect all forms of knowledge. The Australian academies all emerged in the really era of the two cultures and CP Snow, and we're all divided along disciplinary lines. And that has meant that, I guess over time, that we haven't been great defenders of one another's knowledge and the work that we do. And so periodically we get humanities grants ridiculed in the mainstream press. We get climate science challenged, and we haven't been great defenders of one another's work. And I just wonder, we have different academy structures here where all of the disciplines come under one umbrella. And I just wonder how that plays out in different settings. I should add that things are changing in Australia. We recently had our minister veto about $4 million worth of grants in secret. It came out, they were all humanities grants, based on the titles, which he didn't like. But all of the whole research community came out in defence of those projects and in support, which was wonderful for us. But I just wonder if you could reflect on that. Thank you.
You know, I wonder whether there is also a cultural or even linguistic component in your observation, because we have observed already on this podium the use of the word science. Now, science in the English-speaking tradition means a very particular approach to knowledge, right? So basically natural life sciences. Then there are social sciences, but for humanities, in English, we have a different word. In continental traditions, such as in German, you have the same word, which is Wissenschaft. So spontaneously, there is in the perception also of the funding agencies, there is no, so to say, programmatic distinction between different approaches to knowledge, which doesn't make, of course, the life of humanities necessarily better in the German-speaking world than it is in the English-speaking world. And yet, I do believe that there is a hierarchy inherent in the use of the word science that privileges a certain type, let's say the natural or life sciences. The second aspect, which should not be disregarded, is that the results in natural life sciences are more easily measurable or quantifiable than in humanities and social sciences. And as such, so they are more germane to the forms of measurement we now have in science papers, citations, etc. It's easier to acknowledge quality in at least consensual quality in life sciences or social, or to a certain extent in life sciences or natural sciences than it is in humanities or in social sciences. And that leads to these differences.
Moneef.
Thank you. I'd like to reflect slightly, if I may, from a third world perspective and say that the role of universities and researchers and scientists has evolved tremendously over the last 2 decades or 3 decades. The role of university in terms of disseminating knowledge, teaching, generating knowledge, R&D, research and development, and commercializing knowledge, innovation, has evolved dramatically over the last, as I said, 2 or 3 decades. Now, that has led to new concepts coming up, university ranking, quality of higher education, the international outreach of universities, and so on. All this has led to the education community, hopefully, developing a new business model as to how it can deal with this new situation. No longer are higher education institutions separated from their societies. They are more and more an essential component of the societies to which they belong. Very briefly, if I may, I'll just try and talk about something else within the same context. And this is the divide between politicians and scientists. And this is something critical or very important to academies of sciences. The idea, there's always been a divide between policymakers and politicians, policymakers and scientists, because the two communities come from 2 different worlds. And it's one of the functions of academies of sciences would be to try and bridge this divide, which is now wider than ever.
Thank you, Moneef. Thank you. And I think we should finish it there. I'm afraid there's one or two questioners who I'm sure if you come up at the end, you can get your question answered by the individuals. But I think we better let people go roughly just a few minutes after we said we would. Well, three things I guess I want to do. First, I'm biased. I'm a member of the American Philosophical Society. What a pity we lost that wider word, because philosophy was the word in the English language used for this broad meaning of knowledge. But congratulations to the APS for gathering the symposium. It's been, I think, a really, you can see tonight, get a real flavour of what an important event this is. Secondly, thank you to the members of the public who've turned up tonight. Just as Moneef was saying, this relationship, the relationship between engaged, thoughtful citizens and these elite societies is so important. So thank you for coming along and being counted. But thirdly, please join me in thanking our 5 splendid speakers. Thank you.